We really are focusing on how we can commercialize deep technology.
The value chain is so critical to navigate. I always tell people to go after the number 3 player in the value chain.
It takes a lot more than really the best technology and the best science to win in the market.
Having gone through the PhD process, it actually does the opposite of what you want to do if you're an entrepreneur. A lot of them have never been trained on the other things you have to worry about besides technology.
How do we get our companies to that $23 trillion that needs to be unlocked from the private sector?
We took $7 billion and funded 7 hydrogen hubs. $42 billion of private sector came to match that.
What's most unique about us is we're much more comfortable with a higher level of technical risk than I'd say most investors.
Think about how do we invest in the first 10 of a kind? Everyone is first in line to be 8th, 9th, or 10th, just like the original Squid Games. But if we don't move, places like China are going to invest when it is not yet profitable, and they know that on the other side, there's the ability to own a market. The opportunity to expand the grid is massive. We have the technology right now that's proven, and we're not able to implement it, which to me is crazy.
I'm sorry to ask this, but I have to. You were on QVC.
Welcome to SOSV Deep Tech Live. In this episode, SOSV and Women Moving Markets present Commercializing Deep Tech for Industrial Resilience. SOSV General Partner Katie Hoffman sits down with Dr. Vanessa Chan, former Chief Commercialization Officer at the U.S. Department of Energy, and now Vice Dean of Innovation at Penn Engineering, and Dr. Susan Schofer, Chief Science Officer at HAX and Partner at SOSV. The conversation dives into the real-world roadmap for deep tech startups, from lab to market. Tune in for insights on why ARLs may be the most important framework you've never heard of, what it takes to win over the market when you're buried deep in the value chain, how public-private partnerships are unlocking billions, and how startups can get a better seat at the table. From hydrogen hubs to industrial resilience, this episode is a masterclass for anyone involved in the deep tech ecosystem and interested in the keys to commercialization.
Welcome to Deep Tech Live and Women Moving Markets. We really are focusing on how we can commercialize deep technology. And I couldn't be more excited to have 2 women that are experts in their fields and also have the deep expertise at multiple dimensions of the commercialization pipeline. So both of you can introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your scientific background.
Sure. I'm happy to start. I am Vanessa Chan, the inaugural Vice Dean for Innovation Entrepreneurship and the Jonathan Linda Brassington Professor of Practice at the Penn School of Engineering. And yes, that all fits on one business card. Very small font. I started there a little less than 3 months ago because the last 4 years I was with the U.S. Department of Energy, where I was the Chief Commercialization Officer and the Director of the Office of Technology Transitions, where it's very much focused on translating our amazing work that's being done across the nation in laboratories into the real world in the market. And in terms of my scientific background, I have a PhD from MIT in Material Science and Engineering and spent 13 years at McKinsey & Company focused on technology commercialization.
I'm Susan Schofer. I'm a partner here at SOSV, which is where we are today, and also Chief Science Officer for HAX. So I've been at SOSV now for 3 years, and prior to that was really in a variety of startups commercializing technology. So I too started out much more on the science track. I was raised by academics, so didn't really know what else one was do with their lives other than pursue a PhD in science. So I got a PhD in chemistry from Caltech, and then was lucky to really find my way into industry and learn quickly that it's very fun, a lot more fun to really try to take true scientific innovation and actually commercialize it and try to make an impact in the world. And it also just became very clear that it takes a lot more than really the best technology and the best science to win in the market. So there's many more pieces that underlie that whole roadmap of commercializing new technology.
Yeah, I think one main piece of this conversation is that industrial resilience requires public-private partnerships. It requires a lot of capital, and both of you have experience at multiple sides of the investment spectrum. So TRL and ARL are the first things that come to mind. Maybe we could start with the conversation on what ARL might mean specifically as it relates to commercialization.
Oh, be still my beating heart. My favorite topic, adoption readiness levels. So when I was at the Department of Energy, and when I first started on day one of the Biden-Harris administration, DOE was very focused on research and development. 17 amazing national labs that would make Tony Stark go insane in terms of the stuff that's in there. But we really hadn't focused at all in the last two stages, demonstration and deployment of commercialization. And so when Bill and IRA was passed, we had now close to over $500 billion going towards demonstration deployment, which was 10 times the budget for DOE in a year. And so then there was a language that we had to think about because TRLs, raise your hand if you know what TRLs are. Everyone else has raised their hands. It was invented in the 1970s by NASA to launch rockets to the moon. And if you're NASA in the 1970s, you don't care about the price of a rocket. You don't need a permit to land on the moon yet. You don't have to worry about scaling these rockets. And so what happened was this TRL scale became a proxy for deployment, which is when I hit TRL 9, that means I actually can have my technology make it to market. The problem is it doesn't take into account all the other things which investors care about, things like unit economics. No one wants to pay more for anything. So does it actually able to be scaled in a way where it's cost effective for someone to actually buy it? Do we have any issues with the supply chain? Are there issues with regulatory? Do we have any problems with actual demand offtake agreements? And so there's a new language that was needed because when people came and said, we are at TRL 9, therefore everyone will buy it, it's like saying we have built it and they will come, and they weren't coming. And I'm like, there's a lot of other stuff you have to worry about. So we created this new framework called Adoption Readiness Levels, or ARLs, which are a complement to TRLs, and you can still find them at the U.S. Department of Energy's website. And it really is 17 dimensions, which are really critical if you actually want your technology to make it to deployment. And it's a tool which literally takes 1 hour to train someone on. And we use it especially with PhD founders because a lot of them have never been trained on the other things you have to worry about besides technology for something to actually make it into the real world.
It's apropos because at Hacks and SOSV, we really get in at what we would call maybe TRL 2 to 4.
Typically, probably TRL 2 to 4, I think, is
and
where we usually come in.
What's the process look like at Hacks or SOSV when we're making decisions on companies before they get into a process where they might, garner government resources?
Yeah. So, I mean, typically we look at, I think, rather standard things that investors do look at. What's most unique about us is just the early stages that we do invest. So we're much more comfortable with a higher level of technical risk than I'd say most investors. And that's for a few reasons. I mean, we ourselves have a highly technical and also commercial team. So most of us have spent time really building things and really have some technical expertise. But what we tend to look at is, the team. And I think to some of your points, right, a lot of our teams are technical and come from academic backgrounds. So that's often people taking their first steps out of a lab. But, what do we think of that team? Are they able to make that huge mindset shift that they need to make from just obsessing over research and thinking about experiments to thinking about the outside world and what is the impact of this technology? Who wants it? Why do they want it? What does it need to do? And defining that a bit holistically, not only, the technical pieces of it, but also, like you're saying, unit economics, can it scale? Of course, we look at the technologies. And then, of course, what is the market for this? Is this truly addressing that unmet need in the market?
Yeah, and I know, Vanessa, you have deep expertise, especially with your experience at OTT, Office of Technologies Transitions, the Otters, go Otters, that you really have looked at the scale and the liftoff reports that you delivered could potentially be a roadmap to think about as we're looking at deep tech commercialization moving forward.
Yeah, so the Pathways to Commercial Liftoff was an effort that I quarterbacked with the federal agencies, especially DOE, as well as the private sector, because in the end, if you want to commercialize anything, it really is up to the entire ecosystem to be able to do that. And so when we got this infusion of investments into DOE through Bill and IRA, it was the largest investment ever made in clean technology ever for the Department of Energy. And it's a lot of money, but the issue is it pales in comparison to the $23 trillion. Right. It pales in comparison to $23 trillion, right, that you have in the private sector. So the question for us became, how do we have a clean energy transition that is private sector led but government enabled? So how do we use the money that we've gotten to buy down the risk to the point where the private sector will take over? And the question is, when will the private sector take over? When it will lift off? And so our definition of liftoff is when the private sector can actually make money off of whatever it is they're trying to bring to market without needing government incentives or other things like that, because the unit economics and all the other adoption risks have been addressed. And so we created these pathways to commercial liftoff for a dozen technologies, from hydrogen to long duration energy storage to virtual power plants to nuclear. And you can find them at liftoff.energy.gov. They are still there because they're written in a very bipartisan, non-policy way. It was focused on things that have to happen for these technologies actually to make it to market. And we're very deliberate about that because liftoff by definition is we don't need the policy. It's going to work. So the question is, how do we actually get there? And it really has become like a source of truth for the ecosystem to get everyone aligned on what are the things that have to get done for hydrogen to work or nuclear to work and so forth.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask a curveball question. We often talk about the capital stack, and obviously right now, certain things have been withheld, and there is a change in regime. Where do you both think startup companies, especially scale-up companies, can get more active in a more broad-based capital stack that's not reliant necessarily on the U.S. federal government? And or how do you see the state of affairs?
I mean, I certainly think obviously private capital does play a role. I mean, that's exactly where we do play. And I think we have been playing, but really helping to fund companies at that early stage and bridge them and help them climb up the TRL and ARL ladders, right? So by being very hands-on in the way that we work with these companies, both helping them with engineering, but also like thinking about commercialization and some of the things that you're saying so that they're seeing the bigger picture as to what they need to do to really be ready. I mean, the other people that are filling the gap are states, right? So I think both our IndieBio program here and HACS over in New Jersey are well funded by state government and city government. So that helps a lot, I think, to really enable programs like ours that can then further help the ecosystem. And I mean, there's plenty of reasons for that, but I think it makes it really a lot easier for us to build what we need to build when we have that friendly support and really trying to help us do what we want to do, which is build companies, and that's helping them to bring jobs to the state and things like that.
And look, especially if you're a startup, what was interesting was a lot of money that was going out of the door from Bill and IRA was such a big dollar amounts that startups actually even had a hard time engaging in that. And so I think for startups, it really goes down to there are angels and others who are interested. You can actually articulate the pathway that you have to drive down risks, which goes back to the ARLs, is if you can actually understand how you will get there and how the money you're using is going to help you drive down the risk. I think they actually, have no issue in today versus, 10 months ago versus 18 months ago to get funding. And so I think it's really being able to articulate the narrative, as you mentioned, and why is it that you as a startup are able to do something that others can't do? Because I will tell you as an investor, I've seen many of the same startups come through. The question is really around execution and do they understand the ecosystem of how they actually navigate things? I think the other thing too is we have to, as an ecosystem, think differently around capital formation in general. I will say that in the US, we, are capitalistic, which is good, except it also can be bad when we're not yet at the place where we can make money. And so everyone is first in line to be 8th, 9th, or 10th, just like the original Squid Games, where everyone's waiting for the other person to go. But if we don't move, then places like China are going to invest when it is not yet profitable, and they know that on the other side, there's the ability to own a market. So I think there's a need for us to think about how do we invest in the first 10 of a kind instead of just thinking about the first of a kind, the first 10 of a kind, so we can get up the learning curve and to the tipping point where unit economics start to drop down. And I think that is really critical. And I think there's a role for government to play in there, a role for people who actually do offtake agreements, really important to the hyperscalers right now and the roles that they're playing, important role for insurance industry to think about. If you think about nuclear right now, we haven't remembered how to build nuclear, forgot how to do it. And so there's a lot of cost overrun. So how can insurance companies help play a role in there? How can EPCs play a role? And public companies, one of the challenges with them is that they're beholden to shareholder value and earnings per share. And so what happens is that they are wanting to look in a very short-term viewpoint. And many of us know in hard tech, it's a much longer viewpoint. So how do we shift the narrative and the game within the public markets so that we are actually making bets for longer term future that may take some time to get there? And I think in order to do that, we all have kind of like a little bit of a opposite of FOMO, which is we don't want to be the first to go. If you're a public company, let other people go and take the risk. We all need to go together. And I think if we can do that, we actually don't have to worry as much about the government because the private capital is the one that really makes the difference.
The other piece is, I guess, from our perspective, I would say at SOSV is a little bit of like starting small, right? Like you can get there, but you need to start at the right level with the right funding that might be small. Then it's all about execution. Like how do you prove that you can handle that money, do something with it, get to milestones? Then you can start to kind of prove yourself and in that way create a playbook for some success.
And also taking on some commercial risks that the government might or should take on, but actually is now incumbent on the private sector. I mean, the laboratory here, the laboratory in Newark certainly has been supported by government and public-private partnerships, but, bearing the cost of investing in companies is incumbent on a fund. And that is, to your point, there's $23 trillion that needs to be unlocked from the private sector. So how do we, in the earliest stages, get our companies to the point where they can get to folk and then to toke? Are there some examples that you can point to that have been successful on public-private partnership?
Yeah. So, when you look at what we did for the hydrogen hubs, where there's $8 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law that was to go towards hydrogen hubs, we took $7 billion of that and funded 7 hydrogen hubs. And then $42 billion of private sector came to match that. So this idea of the private sector-led, government-enabled was really working and in fact, for the money that went out the door for the Biden administration, it was a ratio of 1 to 6. The other thing that we also realized was that if you read the hydrogen liftoff report, which you can find at liftoff.energy.gov, you can see there that there was an issue around demand and supply in the chicken and the egg, where the supply chain never wants to build itself until it knows it has a long-term offtake agreement. Long-term offtake agreements don't want to happen until they know there's a stable supply chain, and ideally more than one place that they can go buy the things. So you get this like impasse where no one wants to move. And so we took $1 billion of the $8 billion that Congress had allocated toward the hydrogen hubs and created a demand side program, which had never been done by the federal government before. And the reason why we created it was we knew that right now these hubs are not yet at scale, and it's very hard to predict, as anyone who's invested knows, what the actual costs are going to be until you start minting the hydrogen out. And so there becomes a question around who is going to hold the delta and the risk on the contract for differences. If a hub says they can sell it for this much, but then in the end their cost ends up being 30% higher, how does that work? And so we created this $1 billion vehicle for which it could help with the contracting side and the risk around it. So I think that's what's really important, is to think creatively, right, around ways that we can be doing this. And these contract for differences also can be done creatively in the private sector too, right? And I think this is where insurance comes in and all that. And that's why I really think there needs to be a collaborative approach to how we think about financing and risk taking, that is spread across everybody, just like a Kickstarter campaign. We all do a little bit. Then we have enough to be able to compete against places like China. And I think that's really important. Because the thing in the US is we don't do what China and European countries do, where they do a lot of sticks. They will say you are not allowed to do this. And that's why when you take a look at a lot of sustainability products, they start in Europe, then come to California, and then maybe when it's economically viable, goes to the rest of the US. And so that's where, if you take a look at the way we like to operate here in the US in that context, what can we do in that context? Or do we go after Europe first, where they tend to use sticks a lot more than carrots?
Are you seeing anything, Susan, especially in the diligence process and some of the pipeline, both investments that we are thinking about making, and then also areas where we already have investments where some of what Dr. Chan was talking about applies?
We've looked at things like metal 3D printing. There is demand for it. It's going to be really hard to get an industry to shift to these new types of materials. So some of that could come into play there, where we really find ways to support them and stand up some demand, or just signal that there is demand. The other one that we haven't invested in as much, but we have one company in, is like things like carbon capture, right? I mean, one of our reservations on that space is just truly the robustness of the market, kind of short term, medium term, long term. But one investment we made is like in point source carbon capture. So that's something that we do think is going to be a market, because obviously we don't think natural gas fired, coal fired power plants are going away anytime soon, nor is that energy demand. So having something that can do point source carbon capture, having a bit of a clarity perhaps on those markets, I think would help those companies even just set a target as to like, what is our cost target that we need to hit to get there.
And I think as you think about deep tech, and picking up on this from your comment, 3D printing, one of my favorite unicorns as a material science person is Carbon, because of the fact that they were really smart at looking at markets that were easy to enter, that they could have cash flow, while they went for the bigger markets. And so they went after sportswear and Adidas, and they were making these custom shoes, which is great because the barrier to entry in footwear is very low compared to if you're trying to go into aerospace, which is much higher. And so I think that's the other thing that people need to think about is, where are there markets that your technology could go, which may not be as scientifically exciting for you, or may not be as big as what you really want, but it's the stepping stones for you to get to those bigger opportunities. Because I think too often people aren't thinking about the tiny smaller ponds that help you learn to get to the point where you can actually start really thriving.
I think it's a great point. And certainly, like with the companies that we are dealing with, right, at that early stage, it's all about exactly what you're saying. Like, do some actual customer discovery, map out the different market opportunities. And then what you really need is a framework for why you're picking your first one, and kind of then crafting a roadmap to get to the other ones. And I definitely always tell companies, you don't have to go after the biggest market first, right? In fact, there's plenty of reasons to go after smaller markets. Like your carbon example is a great one. Get some traction, demonstrate that you can execute, and thinking about, what is the market I'm ultimately heading towards? What metrics do they care about? And if I can prove some of those on this kind of lower lift, easier pilot to early commercialization, then I actually have stepped myself into a place where I can then go after the bigger market.
So let's take hydrogen. Give some examples of what those steps would look like from seed to commercialization.
So I think the key thing with hydrogen is right now we need to figure out how to manufacture this in a way where it's cost effective. With 45V, there's a $3 per kilogram production tax credit. And so there's different ways in which you can manufacture hydrogen. And so in the case of hydrogen, it's a little bit different than something like 3D printing, because we have these hubs that we need to figure out, how do we actually get this stuff out of a manufacturing plant and into the different end use cases. And that's what the hydrogen hubs had been developed, was really talking about what that kind of ecosystem was going to look like. And so I think in the end, it's all about, how do they actually build these hubs at scale? How much is it going to cost? And then as they start manufacturing, are the unit economics what they thought they would be?
A follow-on to that is, what does it look like to actually partner outside of the government? What does it mean to engage in the relationships with industry in order to make that happen at scale?
I personally love material science commercialization because it's so hard.
We all love the hard
but I,
stuff.
I love it because it's so hard, and so therefore you have to think really creatively. But the key thing in terms of how you interact with the industry is, say you invented a material, right, that is going to be amazing for going into the auto industry, right, because it's going to make the car lighter, it's going to make it look better, whatever, right? So if you are someone who's invented that material and you're a materials company, you then have to figure out how do you take that material and sell it to a tier one who's going to make a part out of it. That tier one then has to sell it to an auto OEM, so like a BMW or a Porsche or whatever, who then will then sell it to an end customer. So your innovation is so far down in the value chain, you have to figure out who are the players that are going to help you get to the point where you actually can get it into a car so that someone will buy it. And that's the engagement that you need, is because the value chain is so critical to navigate. Having served a lot of materials companies in the past, because I just love the space, I always tell people to go after the number three player in the value chain, because number one and two are so busy trying to beat the other person. Number three is like, look at me, I'll try anything to be number one. And so that's kind of the way I go about it. And so that's really where, when you mentioned going and talking to the ecosystem, where it's really important, is really have to understand what is it going to take for your technology to actually get into the hands of a consumer, and all the different steps that you have to go through. And the thing is when you have an established value chain, there are antibodies that come out to attack any new entrants because they like to do what they're doing. They don't want to change it. It's working. And so you have to create enough value that every single player is going to make more money than they would just doing what they're doing today. And if they're not going to make more money, there's no reason for them to adopt this technology. And so I think that's really the kind of engagement you have to understand, is what is the value you're creating at every step of the way? Why does someone want to partner with you? How will they make more money? And then why does the consumer actually care on the very, very last step? Because if they don't care about what you've done, then no one's going to make money because they won't pay more for something.
Looking at the whole value chain is the way. And it really just comes down to understanding what they're doing today, what's happening, how are they doing that, why are they doing that, how can this new technology or new innovation perhaps play a role in changing that. What does that look like? Certainly materials innovation are one of the hardest things, because a material that you make in a lab is very often super different from what you would see in the use case, because I'm making a polymer and now actually I have additives and processing.
And there's a role that those of us that are investors and government play in being intermediaries, because it's difficult for a company coming from the lab to get to the next level of TRL or ARL. And oftentimes investors and government, even if you're giving a check, don't necessarily support companies in the next level of getting to that stage of commercialization, which means relationships. It means, negotiations. It means understanding the legal structures.
Well, I'm actually going to pivot your question a little bit, and this is why I've gone back to academia, is that I realized the challenge that we have is how do we actually train our students, right, especially engineers and scientists, to have an impact in the world. And we don't train anywhere these types of skills like negotiating, cold calling, being able to listen. I know that sounds weird, but I think, when you are growing up in high school, where to get into many of these elite institutions, you need the perfect GPA, you need to overload on courses, you have to be the captain of this and just say how amazing you are. You're not necessarily the most humble person, for lack of a better word. And so I think there's a mindset shift that we need, where people are learning to listen, to absorb, to see what's going on in the world and connect those things. And so one of the things that I'm working on right now at Penn Engineering is figuring out how do we actually go beyond just the paper publications, go beyond just the 4.0 GPA, because anyone who's been in the real world knows being the smartest person in the room is actually really bad because nobody likes you.
Yep.
And if people don't like you, they don't want to help you. And so you actually are better off, being more humble and really kind of understanding how to work with people and understanding how to communicate and listen. And so that's really what I'm hoping to build out, is making people aware of what the real world looks for. So everyone coming out of Penn Engineering will actually know, well, if I'm going to look at value chains, this is what it means. And it's not because I want them to do startups, but I think any engineer that's out there in the real world actually needs to understand how the real world works and have the real world skills to do it. And so, I always tease my students. I was like, if you haven't gotten a C in any class, then you have failed, because I will not hire the 4.0 GPA that has 3 majors because they've spent all their time studying and they actually haven't gone out and done anything. And what I tell my students is, like, when you're going to interview and maybe you get through the screen, but you have no story to tell. You can be like, oh, I took 7 classes one semester and I didn't sleep. Versus the other person who maybe took 4 classes and was like, oh, I had this idea and I went after it and here's the things I learned. That makes for a good interview. And so I think that's a lot of what I'm trying to do, is get people away from the way our high schools train our students right now to focus only on GPA and grades and classroom and exams, because I don't think it's serving us well.
I really value fundamental education, so I would never want to change that. And I think it's super important. So from my perspective, you can't just go project-based and application-based from day one. You need to build up fundamentals. But I also agree, we need to expose people to what it really means to be in the real world, which really doesn't happen, at least didn't happen for me all the way through the end of my PhD. And we really need to, exactly as you're saying, teach people to be humble, because that's the first thing you need to do, right? While in the academic world, it's I need to be the smartest person. I better know the answer before I say one word. I need to totally own this or I would never say anything. You actually need to go out in the world and talk to people, engage them, understand them, and communicate, right? Which I think is, at least for me, one of the biggest learnings always is you cannot over communicate, especially when you're commercializing technology, because there's so many different stakeholders. They all need to kind of be brought along together. So it's so important to learn those communication skills and just never forget that that's kind of the number one thing you need to do if you're going to take something that doesn't exist and bring it out into the world where it can exist and where, you're its parent maybe, but it takes a village to raise this technology from 0 to 1. So, yeah,
and to be clear, I absolutely do believe in fundamental education. We have to understand the science and technology if we're going to make any difference in the world. But similar to how I don't poo-poo TRLs, I love TRLs, it's just not sufficient.
Yeah.
So for me, the way in which we are teaching our bachelor's and PhDs is insufficient to really be able to have a bigger impact in the world. And, having gone through the PhD process, it actually does the opposite of what you want to do if you're an entrepreneur. It literally does, because you are sitting there and you're trying to, get that 4.0 GPA so you can get into a prestigious PhD program. When you're there, they say, don't talk to anyone about what you're doing because you don't want to get scooped. You want to make sure you're able to publish your paper, so don't tell anyone. And you're like, okay, I won't tell anyone about what I'm doing. And then your final thing that you have to do is you have to defend your PhD, defend it. So basically you're told, everyone asks you a question, you have to tell them why they're stupid, and you're defending yourself like Wonder Woman, right? And you're the smartest person in the room. And if you were to take that into a entrepreneur, that entrepreneur will not be okay in terms of their ability, because a good entrepreneur is someone who listens actively and then understands why someone is coming and asking those questions. And so I will never invest in someone who actually can't answer my question or understand my question or tells me why my question is wrong. And so I tell a lot of people who are entrepreneurs, I was like, you're born with 2 ears, 2 eyes, and 1 mouth, and you should use it in that ratio. And if you don't understand or you disagree with the person who's asking the question, especially investor, especially a customer, you have to just ask, why do you think that? That curiosity isn't there. Instead, they've been working on this baby for 7 years, and they're going to hit them on the head with the baby and say, this baby's amazing. This is why it's it. And they're missing the point. And so I think that's a lot of the mindset that I think we need to really retrain our students on.
100%.
I'm sorry to ask this, but I have to. You were on QVC. And because you actually did decide that you were going to make a shift and test things, what was that experience like, getting out of academia into the world and taking your patents to life?
It was amazing. It was super scary. And so I had been at McKinsey for about 13 years at that point, which in dog years is a really long time. And I was realizing the next generation has to be entrepreneurial. But, being a McKinsey partner is not entrepreneurial because you're getting a paycheck. You don't have to worry about cash flow or anything like that. And so I'm like, I really want to try to do this. And my daughters are at a school called Springside Chestnut Hill Academy. where they are trying to create the next entrepreneurs of the world. And they actually start in pre-K, where in pre-K, they actually are coloring things that say, if I make a mistake, it means I'm learning. And that mindset is there. So in second grade, my kid had an invention, which was these hair hugs she had made to prevent her hair from getting caught in her jacket. She did prototyping. She did customer surveys to figure out what color to make them, and she had to do a pitch. And I was looking at the second grader going, and she's now 19. I was like, wow, how is it possible that she's able to do this? And I'm a maker. In fact, I just started a pottery studio in Philly. I knit, I make jewelry, I do all kinds of crazy stuff. And I'm always jury rigging things in my house to make my life better. And I'm like, I'm kind of cool to bring some of those to market. And Joy, the movie, had just come out where she brought her mop to QVC. So I had this crazy idea. I was like, I'm going to bring some of my inventions to QVC. And I decided to leave McKinsey, started a Kickstarter campaign, understood how to do branding, videos, all that kind of stuff, how to try to get viral. Because, when I grew up, the way to get privacy on a phone was to have a very, very long cord from the kitchen to the living room. So all this stuff was like completely foreign to me. And then competed on the Today Show for America's Next Big Thing and landed a contract on QVC to sell my stuff. And it was amazing because I threw myself out there in a way I never would have. And my favorite story ever in my career was when I had left the semifinals of the Today Show. And Steve Martin was there that day, which was really kind of fun, hanging with him in the green room. And I was in my hair and makeup, looking completely glam and fabulous. And I get onto the train back to Philadelphia. And a woman says to me, "Aren't you that woman who was on QVC or on Today Show today trying to sell something, trying to get on QVC?" I was like, "Yeah, that's me." She's like, "What?" I was like, "Oh, it's my headphone, my invention." Like, of course, I wore my tangle-free headphones around my neck all the time. And I was showing her the invention. She's like, "That's so cool." And she's like, "Hey, everyone. And like, we're riding in the car of a train. And she's like, "Guys, look at her. She was on Today's Show today. And we need to vote for her." Because the way it worked was there's a voting thing where whoever got the most votes in the semifinals would make it to the finals. It was like, we have to vote for her because she's trying to get a contract on QVC. So go stand up, do your thing. So I stood up and did my thing in this like car of people. And they were like, "Oh, okay, how do I vote?" There's one guy who had never really used an app before for voting. So he was like figuring out how to download that stuff. Because like, yeah, my grandkids gave me this phone. I'm not sure how to use it. So we helped him. And then the entire car said to me, "You now need to go to the rest of train 2165 and get them all to vote." I was like, "Are you nuts?" I was like, there's like former clients on this train. In fact, there's probably a former McKinsey partner on here like, "Oh man, Vanessa, she's on hard times." she's like going, hawking her wares. And they were like, "No, you have to go, because what if it's like train 2165 that prevents you from winning this?" And I'm like, "You guys I can't." And they literally wouldn't let me sit down, and they pushed me out. And as we're like, going down towards Philly, I was like, step by step. And I figured that, if you ever been Amtrak, it was good to kind of get the 8-seat thing. So I'd stand there and then go to the next one. So I did 3 of my demos there. There's one guy who saw me coming, like pretend to be sleeping. But I ended up winning the semifinals. No idea if it's because of train 2165. And like when I got off the train, everyone's like cheering and clapping, saying, "You got this, you got this." And this was like entire trainload of strangers who didn't know me, but were cheering me on. And it just gave me such joy because of the fact that people are fundamentally good. People fundamentally want to help you. And so that's where I really loved this journey, because it gave me the strength to do something that I was super uncomfortable with. It also gives me street cred to help people do something you're very uncomfortable with, because I've done it. And then you don't know where it's going to lead. And I don't think I thought when I was on QVC, I would then become a presidential appointee a few years later. But that's where just life takes you.
So the best way to end this conversation is where you both see the trajectory going towards 2030 and any insights for entrepreneurs and investors in that front.
Obviously, we're in an interesting time, right? Things are shifting here in the US a bit, but I would say plenty of reasons to be very optimistic, especially, thinking about what we kind of came in here on around, the future of industrialization and kind of what does that look like. I think there's plenty of opportunities and exciting opportunities for new technologies, right? Like certainly nearshoring is going to continue to be a big theme that we need to work on. Energy security is a big one. So I would say, there's lots of ways that we see innovators approaching that, right? How do we create the future sustainable products and future sustainable manufacturing methods? I would say lots of opportunities for people to automate processes so that we can take things back from places where we've gone to because labor is really inexpensive and perhaps labor is not being really protected in a good way. So how do we do that through automation? How do we think about new materials and even new manufacturing methods? Things like, 3D printing batteries, which we have a company pursuing, is a way that we can bring energy storage here and do it, make new materials in a way that we can do it here. And then also just technologies like electrochemistry that allow us to do cleaner processes for processing minerals or recycling batteries, things like that. All of those technologies, I think, are relevant in whatever political climate because it really allows us to make things that we need, that we'll continue to need. So those things I think are persevering and give lots of opportunities for innovators to think of new materials and new processes to address that.
When I look towards 2030, which I remember we're looking towards 2020 and now we're looking at 2030. I remember we're looking towards 2000. So it's like time is flying. But I think that we have the opportunity to really go strong and go hard in the things that we're trying to do. I think that people see transitions as ones where they have to stop doing everything to see what's going to happen. We always have transitions. It's never a good time to have a baby. It's never a good time to invest. It's never a good time to do anything, right?
Yeah.
And if you overthink it, nothing happens. And so that's where I think people just need to be willing to take more risk and to not overthink things. I think we have been trained to overthink, and I think that really hurts us because we just don't try new stuff. And so what I'm hoping, in the next kind of 5 years is that the ecosystem isn't overthinking and they are collaborating together, sharing risks together, and thinking really boldly about things that they can do in a different way. I also think the education system is going to start to evolve as well, which I'm excited about. And I think this next generation, I'm so hopeful for. I mean, the conversations I have with my kids' generation and the way they're thinking, their sophistication, their ability to be humble actually is much better than I think we were. And I just really I'm full of hope because of that.
Well, let's leave it on hope and the next gen. On that, I want to thank both of you, Dr. Schofer, Dr. Chan, for your time.
Thank you.
And for making it here from Pennsylvania and Newark. Thank you so much.
Thank you.